All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at this special webinar. My name is Rahul Mehta, and I'm a community advocate born and raised in what is now Mississauga, Ontario. And you can see we have Jenni here as well. So we'll be playing around with the format as the video progresses. So bear with us as you'll also be seeing some slides today. But a little bit about myself before we continue. I have the privilege to work with newcomers here in Mississauga on cycling education, building accessibility to more sustainable modes of transportation. And that project is called Mississauga Cycles. As a volunteer, I'm thrilled to continue to do this work in a small group I started called Sustainable Mississauga, and of course, being part of this new campaign, Stop Sprawl Peel. This webinar is about the future of Peel Region, and it's been coordinated by a leading Canadian environmental advocacy organization known to you as Environmental Defence. The Stop Sprawl Peel community is growing, and they've been a big part of this as well. This community includes residents and organizers from across Peel Region, and we've been working to educate, inform, and mobilize others to help the elements of Peel, Caledon, Brampton, and Mississauga grow more sustainably and protect our remaining farmland and green space. So before we get to know a little bit about our guests here today, I would like to do a land acknowledgement here based in Peel Region, but we are all coming from different parts of Peel. Maybe you're coming from outside of Peel Region. I encourage all of us who are non-Indigenous to learn about the land we are on today and to learn about the long history of the lands which will be impacted by things like sprawl in Peel Region. The history of this land goes back much farther than settlers like myself learned about in classrooms and history books. And we're trying to make up for that lack of learning today. Since I'm joining you from Mississauga, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we live and work is part of the treaty lands and traditional territory of the Mississauga of the Credit. For thousands of years, Indigenous peoples inhabited and cared for this land. In particular, I wanted to acknowledge the territory of the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Ojibwa-Chippewa peoples. The land that is home to the Métis, and most recently, especially here in Mississauga, the territory of the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation, who are direct descendants of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We're all grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land, and by doing so, give our respect to its first inhabitants. As we begin this webinar, I also want us to keep in mind that it is Black, Indigenous, and people of color who have been and continue to be disproportionately impacted by things like pollution, climate change, and environmental injustice. And this ties directly to some of the issues we'll be raising today in this webinar. Now you'll see we have an additional speaker who's just popped in, and I would love to introduce who you'll be hearing from today. With us today, we have myself, who you already know, and we also have Phil Pothen, Ontario Environment Program Manager for Environmental Defence. And we have Jenni Le Forestier, Community Advocate with Stop Sprawl Peel and the Stop the 413 Community Group. Please give a quick hello, Phil and Jenni.
Hello, everyone.
It's so great to have you here. Thank you both for making time today. I'll actually be sharing some slides as well following Jenni's presentation, giving a bit of context to Mississauga and what we can perhaps learn for better or worse for the situation in Brampton and Caledon. Now, a little bit of extra housekeeping before we get started. I wanted to explain a bit about how you can interact with us in this webinar. So some of you might be watching this live, some of you might be watching the recording later on. But there is actually a chat box if you're watching this live. You can find it at the bottom or right corner of your screen on YouTube. Feel free to say hello in the chat. You can discuss with each other. And of course, you can send us any questions you have, which we'll try to cover in a Q&A at the end of our presentations. If you're watching this later as a recording, or you don't have a YouTube account and can't add questions, you can also email your questions to us at info@yourstoprotect.ca. We'll do our best to answer as many questions that we receive today in the Q&A session, like I said. And if we do miss a question which we really want to answer, we'll try and find a way to put it out there following the presentation. All right, so I'm excited to get your questions, and I'm really excited to hear from our first speaker. I will hand it over to you, Jenni.
Thank you so much, Rahul, and thank you, Phil, for doing this webinar on Peel Region. I'm just going to start with my first slide, which is actually a quote from the Ontario Federation of Agriculture. It's one of my favorites, and that is that humanity owes its existence to 6 inches of soil and the fact that it rains. And I think that is very relevant to our discussion today about the Greenbelt and the future of Peel. Next slide, please. Citizens across the Greater Golden Horseshoe have been organizing and speaking up at their local councils about the requirements each region has had to comply with during a health crisis. Thousands of acres have been saved so far in Hamilton and Halton region. We hope to save 10,000 acres of prime farmland and greenbelt lands that are at risk of being gutted for inappropriate land use and sprawl. Next slide, please. Despite climate emergencies being declared in all 3 cities, not one municipality in Peel has addressed the fact that an urban boundary expansion in the southern portion of Caledon will increase pollution. The boundary expansion is mostly to accommodate warehousing for e-commerce and trucking depots. There are some sprawling subdivisions interwoven between these proposals, but they are mostly townhomes and single-family dwellings that start at $900,000. The 2051 boundary expansion is not for affordable housing and will only further increase the region of Peel's greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. Instead of preservation, we're seeing a systematic degradation of the Peel Plain. This is A1 prime farmland, EP1 and 2 designated lands that are being rezoned during the pandemic without proper public oversight ahead of the region finalizing its municipal comprehensive review. Rezoning sensitive lands with multiple tributaries and creeks from prime agricultural to prestige industrial is such an extreme change of use and is not compatible with the local rural community where many still see value in pursuing farming close to the GTA. Next slide, please. Prime agricultural lands near the route of the 413 are littered with development signs, while the town of Caledon continues to support the 413 despite residents' objections. Next slide, please. This is a chart with the data of the amount of land that has current development applications that was tallied by a local resident this past week. So we have over 3,000 acres up for development. 877 acres are for warehousing or industrial. Over 2,000 acres are for housing. 64 acres are for aggregate, although that doesn't include agricultural lands that are also slated for aggregate that are not yet applied for. And almost 3,000 acres of prime agricultural land and EPA lands are on the chopping block. Next slide, please. Not all agricultural land is in the Greenbelt. There is A1 class soil in the Peel Plain or White Belt, where developers are lobbying for the region of Peel to expand their urban boundary. Only 4.8% of Canadian land mass is prime land. Only 0.5% of it has class 1 soil, and it's right here in Southern Ontario. It simply must be preserved. Next slide, please. The owner of St. Mary's CBM, which is a Brazilian strip mining conglomerate, is proposing to blast and excavate a hole over 80 feet deep and below the water table, situated on 800 acres of forest and farmland in the heart of the Caledon Greenbelt and the Greenland system in Peel. The town of Caledon has been stating that 80% of land is not open for development. However, if you rezone lands outside of settlement boundaries and draft settlement boundaries, is that still true? If you account for the amount of agricultural land that is slated for aggregate production, how much land is really being protected? Next slide, please. Now more than ever before, food security is crucial. The Ontario Federation of Agriculture last week declared their concerns about a massive disruption in the world's food supply chain. Yet Peel is planning to expand the boundary for sprawling subdivisions that will not address the affordable housing crisis, the looming food security crisis, but instead this land is being rezoned for trucking and for warehousing. Next slide, please. A Toronto Star article last year identified that agricultural land is valued as low as $18,000 an acre, but residential land is easily worth over $1 million an acre. So there are hundreds of millions of dollars to be made around rezoning these farmlands for a new freeway. And there are billions more to be made in the future from developing those lands into unsustainable sprawl. But this doesn't account for the industry of the farming community, and it doesn't account for food security, and it certainly doesn't account for a climate emergency and the cost of that emergency through mitigation of climate impacts. Next slide, please. So development continues despite an Ontario Land Tribunal settlement. The Bolton residential expansion study has been a hotly contested issue between the town of Caledon and the region of Peel. Mayor Thompson has been lobbying for a freight village in the area that planners refer to as Option 6. The region of Peel wanted housing in the southern portion due to the infrastructure costs required if Caledon were to sprawl in the north. The town of Caledon prefers to allow developers to build on Option 3 lands, which are on the northern section where there is no servicing. This will cost the region of Peel millions more. The issue went to LPAT and a settlement was reached. Now, because of the Minister of Housing designating lands in Option 6 as provincially significant employment zones, the town is allowing warehousing and trucking industry to sprawl throughout the southern portion of Caledon and along the Brampton border. Next slide, please. There have been 4 MZOs approved in Caledon, with another 3 requested. They are typically the opposite of sustainable growth. The application in the center is for warehousing on Torbram Road. The applicant was missing maps at the public information meeting. There are no experts present to comment on the requirements needed to redirect a creek. An MZO was applied for to the Minister of Housing before the public meeting had even occurred. The example on the right is for a 2.2 million square foot warehouse that will impact the greenbelt and endangered species. Both of these examples are for warehousing and e-commerce that will impact the greenbelt prime farmland. Caledon receives and in fact enhances large portions of the watershed that ends in Lake Ontario. A creek that runs through the Torbram warehouse application was acknowledged by the consultant simply stating, "We will redirect it." Redirection through unnatural concrete swales and watersheds is risky at best. Next slide, please. This is the draft settlement boundary map to 2051. The future strategic employment lands in pink are also part of the focus study area for the 413. The map clearly demonstrates there are greenbelt fingerlings and several tributaries in these sections, but that is where many applications for warehousing and trucking are being proposed. Next slide, please. This is the Caledon Go Train. The residents call it the Ghost Train, because despite considerable pushing by the local municipal mayors and the province, the end story is that the train isn't coming until after 2051. Carefully worded promotion leads the public to believe that when they buy their new home, it comes with train service. For the next 30 years, it will be vacant land. Recently, Ford made a major announcement with both the mayor of Vaughan in Caledon and Brampton that the arrival of the GO train would be accelerated. There is, as of yet, no approvals, no budget, or any documents to prove this is the case. Yet land surrounding the proposed GO train has been unlocked for sprawl. Next slide, please. A boundary expansion will not result in affordable homes. A quick Google search provides the current real estate prices in the area. This is not affordable housing. In Caledon, the minimum lot area is 3,000 square feet. Sprawl is expensive. Instead of looking at how many people per hectare can be accommodated affordably, we keep repeating the same model of subdivisions or homes with huge footprints. Shockingly, the McMansion on the left is actually zoned agricultural. The land is agricultural, but the house is definitely not a farmhouse. With proper zoning, this house should never have been built on a rural road with limited water supply. Next slide, please. This is a chart that demonstrates the comparative cost of sprawl from the Smart Prosperity Institute. The city's annual cost per household for urban planning versus suburban. And you can see the suburban cost is almost more than double. Next slide, please. This is an example of potentially adaptive reuse. Nanny suites, garden suites, co-op housing, triplexes, duplexes. So many options could be accommodated if planners would think creatively. This is a heritage home that hopefully will be incorporated into the subdivision and could be a great example of social housing rather than letting the house just, fall down. Next slide, please. So the Municipal Comprehensive Review needs a do-over. 30 years of planning Peel's future during a global health crisis and a series of lockdowns is not the best way to make sure that the public is consulted. The region sent out 700 surveys, but Peel's estimated population is well over 1.5 million. 309 residents wrote to Peel Region requesting that the MCR process be postponed, but they were ignored. Yet 14 individual letters from private landowners requesting that Peel expand its settlement boundaries has been considered. It's time for Peel residents to speak up and let their councillors know that we want a zero boundary expansion. Please register today for the April 7th Peel Regional Growth Committee and have your say. Thank you, Rahul.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for that really information-packed presentation. I think it's really telling to think about not just what the consequences can be of this project on the edge of Brampton and Caledon, but like you were showcasing, there's a lot of effects that spread outwards and downstream throughout the cities that already are built out. Right, the pollution, the salt, the flooding, it doesn't stay in one place. And we really have to think about not just, our food systems, but what are going to be the impacts on the food systems left with the consequences of this development. And it's really eye-opening to see just what's being proposed.
It really is shocking. And looking at the impacts that spread further north and further south, as you've mentioned, it's the hidden impacts that we don't even see or know about. It's much more than just what we see on a development application. It's the rolling effects that we have to really be looking at if we're planning, especially 30 years out.
Absolutely. And to all of those great slides, I hope we are going to get lots of questions to further unpack what you've shared. I do want to remind our audience, please do submit your questions. You can type them into that chat wherever you're watching this live. And if you're watching it live or afterwards recorded, you can email to info@yours2protect.ca. So thank you again, Jenny. And I'll take it now actually for a few slides of my own.
Thank you.
So I did want to try to live up to Jenny's incredible presentation capabilities and give a little bit of a story or case study, perhaps, of Mississauga. We have, in a way, been there, done that, for those of you who live in this city. And there are some lessons to be learned from what our city has done wrong and how we're trying to correct course. So let's unpack Mississauga. If you've ever traveled through Mississauga, if you live in Mississauga, whether you want to admit it or not, we are the nexus of sprawl, and we are probably the most representative suburb of sprawl because we did it first and we did it fast. Mississauga is now largely built out. There are small pockets of room to develop still or redevelop, but most of our city looks like this. Single-family homes with a lot of streets that do not connect to one another. We're not very good at making streets in a grid. And in places where there aren't the homes or the industrial warehouses, we have some tall towers. And these, of course, have been going up very rapidly in recent years around what was part of the first founding developments of the city proper, which you can see there, the Square One Mall. And we'll come back to that towards the end of the presentation. So it can sometimes be hard to sense, well, Mississauga's built out. How could we have fit more people? How could we have done any better? And I always find it interesting to go on Google Maps because, of course, we have lots of spare time to do that in our day and take a look at the same scale. What does our city look like compared to others? So if anyone can guess, perhaps they know what the city on the right is. This is looking at a roughly 3 kilometers square area of Mississauga on the left, just east of the downtown, and downtown Barcelona, if you were able to guess that correctly, on the right. There's quite the contrast, not just in the visual. They have more use of red in their rooftops, but the numbers are telling. Sprawl is claiming to be efficient when it's built, providing homes for people, providing jobs. But sprawl is ultimately all about inefficiency. You can see certainly that if you're ever on a highway, how much land is wasted on either side. But you can really see it when you look at the numbers compared to other cities that we do love to showcase in some of our presentations and in many of our destinations. So on the left, you have under 50,000 people and under 20,000 jobs in Mississauga in that particular area. On the right, it's more than a factor of 10. So you're looking at more than 500,000 people in about the same area of land. Can we do that now? Obviously not. Are we trying to, and do we need to densify and protect some of the other resources to our north, such as farmland in Caledon? Yeah, I think so. And, this is something we are grappling with as a city. Can we find a way to correct course and bring in the jobs and people that are now being pushed to the edge of the city or to other municipalities entirely? When it comes to housing, like you've seen in that bird's eye view, we don't have the most diverse housing stock. And this is in part due to how we have zoned our city, and as zoning is true right across the province. Most of our city's land is actually designated for the type of housing which we associate with sprawl: single family, semi-detached, and maybe a townhouse here or there. You can see that is largely captured in the yellow. So that's about 3/4 of our city's land. The other quarter is mostly in blue, and those are predominantly warehouses. So often single-story buildings, industrial buildings. They've got great jobs, but they aren't the best use of land. And there's ways that those areas could have been densified. And now, we often have to wait to see when the building stock is going to be renewed. Now, the real challenge here is, warehouses, houses, or the towers, which make up tiny pockets, also pockets to come in the white, they aren't a solution any one of their own. Having a mix is great, but having more housing options is even more urgently needed in this city. What we're seeing now is that the types of developments we created, they don't sustain themselves. So the cost to service, to build, and to pave to these locations, it just doesn't come back in things like the development charges, which are charged for these developments. What does this mean for the bigger picture of housing in the city? Unfortunately, when we don't have housing choice and housing supply doesn't keep up because we're not densifying, for example, what we call established neighborhoods, well, the price goes up, and it's going up exponentially. In Mississauga, the price has gone up just during the pandemic. So since this last statistic you see here, it has almost doubled when you're looking at detached housing, and by up to 50% when you're looking at semi-detached and condominiums. That is not affordable for anybody. A condo at 700,000 or a house at 1.5 million. We might think that this is an inevitable trajectory, but it's not. And the answer to this isn't building more on the fringes. It's about rethinking how we build within our built area. Because when we build within our built area, things like sewers, pipes, and roads, they're already there. It's much less expensive to service these types of developments. Now, in transportation, I've already mentioned we have highways, and boy, do we have a lot of them. Mississauga has the most highways in the country of any municipality, and we have the busiest and largest highway seen here, newly expanded Highway 401. These highways continue to expand, but somehow congestion continues to get worse, and this is not surprising if you have heard of the concept of induced demand. Widening a highway encourages more traffic, and unfortunately for Mississauga, a lot of that traffic is coming from our neighbors. Do we want to do the same in North Brampton and worse in Caledon? I'm not so sure. The consequences of induced demand, like Jenni showed so well in her presentation, is encouraging sprawl. They aren't just meant to be a highway to connect from here to there. such as from Vaughan to Milton. They're really about packing in sprawl-style development on either side. And the consequences, well, they're expensive and they don't deliver on what they promised. Here's what the 401 looks like most of the time. No matter how many lanes you add, the traffic just keeps piling up. Now, we're trying to find solutions in Mississauga. We've tried to put in transit. We have one BRT. We're hoping to put in a train, so that's light rail transit on Huron, Ontario. But you can see it's not a lot compared to the highways and roads we already provide for driving. So putting in choice after the fact is a whole lot harder and a whole lot more expensive if you've already dumped billions, in this case, into a new highway. What's going to be left for Brampton and Caledon if they put in $6 billion for the 413? It's something to think about. Of course, there are a lot of policies and plans which guide and direct how all of this should be built, how we should move, and what targets we should set in the future. This is just an example showing transportation-related policies. The problem is those policies can be interpreted, so there's a gray area, especially if you're looking at higher levels of government, regional and provincial. What we can say about this is there's still alternative paths Brampton and Caledon can take. Mississauga's trying, but again, it's a lot harder once you've already built out. We have ambitious climate change plans. We declared an emergency in 2019. Our council rejected the 413 just last year, and we're trying to invest a lot in transit. The challenge is the money just isn't there. And so we're having trouble funding all of these plans you see along the bottom because the money, well, it's already gone to service and build the sprawl which we have. Do we want to repeat that mistake to our neighbors? And these are the consequences. Jenni also highlighted this well. The Toronto Star talked about Mississauga's last family farm a few years ago. And you can see, if you remember in the first picture, that's square one, opened in 1973, just a year before the city of Mississauga was incorporated. We used to have a lot of farmland, and of course, we weren't going to protect it all, but did we protect any? Did we think about issues like food security, natural spaces, and the needs of a burgeoning population? It's a real challenge now when our deficit keeps growing for us to provide things like this, which we now say are so important: climate action, local food, smart technology, and transit. If the deficit is growing and we don't have space for housing, how are we going to pay for everything? It's something to think about for sure. We can also look at the fact that Mississauga has a huge deficit in parkland already, and we have a huge affordable housing waitlist. We know the housing in Brampton and Caledon will not be affordable no matter how far out we sprawl. So are we going to face that reality and start to rethink how we build housing in our city? The next speaker, Phil, is going to talk a little bit more about the policies which can help us make that transition. And there is hope. You know, even with all of the struggles and challenges that Mississauga has faced, we are trying to take a different direction. That includes, of course, densification, mid-rise, and the missing middle housing you hear so much about in the news. Things like townhouses, things like below 4 stories, housing, small duplexes, triplexes, etc. These can be incorporated with the higher density we're used to so that you actually have a range of options and you have guaranteed affordable housing. These are an example of 2 projects along the waterfront in Mississauga, which are trying to strike that balance and trying to reimagine what our city could look like for hopefully many more people who, of course, want to live here and live here affordably. It's really a question of what direction we want to take right now in the lands in North Brampton, West Brampton, and South Caledon. Do we want to imagine the future today, as Mississauga has spent decades of trying to achieve, or do we want to continue the unfortunate, costly project that is sprawl further northwards, repeating what Mississauga now realizes is a mistake from years before? What does this all mean for Peel Region? Well, that single-family detached houses are still being built, and guess what? They're not getting any cheaper. The prices are rising into the millions, and we are losing some of the best farmland in Ontario and in Canada. It's really a question of efficiency. It's a question of priorities. And I think if Mississauga can be an example to the rest of the region, it is we made some serious mistakes, and it's a lot more expensive to fix them after they have been made. We have an opportunity to learn from the future directions we're taking now. And I think what we've heard from Jenni and what we'll hear from Phil will further the push to stop sprawl and reimagine what we can do with that precious farmland, forests, and wetlands we have left. And that's all for me. And now we're going to dig a bit deeper into looking at the policy and what really could be possible for Peel Region with our friend here, Phil. Phil, thank you so much for being here, and I'll hand it over to you.
Hi, folks. It's good to talk to you all. So I'm Ontario Environment Program Manager with Environmental Defense, but I'm also a land use planning and environmental lawyer. So, this kind of process is something I've been working on for most of my career, frankly. I started out with the provincial government as counsel for the government, and then I was in private practice for quite a few years. So I'm really approaching this presentation with a view to showing how advocates can actually push for a plan that will comply with the law, but also avoid sprawl. So I guess the key takeaway I kind of want to leave you with is that the current draft Peel official plan, it's a mess. It is a plan to squander Peel's last best chance at a sustainable future. And so if we want to have any chance at fixing the problems that Jenni and Rahul have identified in Peel as it exists today, if we want to avoid making them a lot worse and building more communities with the same problems, we're going to have to really chuck the existing Peel 2051 official plan draft, which is up for discussion right now, in the trash, and in many respects start from scratch with a very different approach. So here is a sort of breakdown of the overall effect of the Peel Region official plan in its current draft form. It would more than double the rate of sprawl. And really, Peel Region is one of the epicenters of sprawl in the Greater Golden Horseshoe already. This would double the rate at which that sprawl happens. It would add an existing, an extra 10,872 acres to the current 16,640 acre glut of unused greenfield land that's already been marked for development in Peel Region and is still sitting unused. And so this altogether would mean that by 2051, we'd be bulldozing roughly 27,500 more acres of land that's already been destroyed. So that area that would be bulldozed, that hasn't been bulldozed yet, it's all shown in yellow on this this particular drawing. And I just kind of want to put this in context here. They want to use 27,500 more acres by 2051. Between 2001 and 2019, Peel only used 8,698 acres. And it wasn't the lack of land supply that was the reason for that. It's not like the province was stopping folks from building. There's a huge amount, essentially everything in the light yellow rather than the orange yellow on this drawing, that was already available for sprawl. But this plan would try to force things along and really swallow up all of the land that's already been set aside, plus extra land by 2051. So from an environmental point of view, I'm from environmental defense, this would have a huge environmental impact. Just compare here the what we call contested countryside, greenfield land, unprotected habitat, and farmland that's outside development right now on the left, with what things would be like on the right, 2051. So we'd be talking about paving the headwaters of Campbell's Cross Creek, which is an important tributary of the West Humber River, and some of the other key tributaries of the West Humber River. And these aren't just random creeks. These provide some of the last remaining habitat for the endangered red-side dace, and they also contain some of the best farmland that remains in Ontario and Canada. And for all sorts of reasons that we can get into later, this is farmland we can't spare now, and it's going to become more and more important in the future. So it's worth noting, when we think of sprawl, we think of residential sprawl. We think of suburban streets with driveways and garages where everyone needs to drive. And that's certainly a big part of the sprawl that's being proposed. It's 3,000 hectares of residential sprawl. There are also 1,400 hectares of industrial and warehouse sprawl that are proposed. If I recall correctly, the area in red is planned for further residential expansion, and the area in blue is for industrial development, which, according to the plan, is mostly intended for warehouse and distribution center type uses. And just to really kind of underline what kind of use we're talking about, it's these extremely horizontal, obviously not walkable or easily accessible by frequent transit sort of distribution facilities. So these are largely places, warehouses essentially, from which you'd be delivering packages for e-commerce, or else just to where you'd be storing things and distributing them for shops. Now, so we're talking about commercial sprawl, or sorry, industrial sprawl, and then we would have 3,000 more hectares of car-dependent greenfield sprawl. And so I just want to underline that this really is sprawl that we're talking about. One of the common talking points you'll hear from proponents of boundary expansions: oh, we're not talking about sprawl because it's well planned, and sprawl is unplanned development or poorly planned development. But you've just heard from Rahul what a sprawling mess Mississauga is right now. The existing community areas, residential areas of Mississauga are right now. And Mississauga right now has a density of 87 people and jobs per hectare. And that is very clear that they don't have what's needed and that's not counting the carve-outs, etc. That's nowhere near what's needed, the way they've defined it, to achieve a high active transportation modal share. And they don't have it. They haven't achieved that. So what this bad scenario that Rahul's been describing, if you look, the plan would have Brampton and Caledon by 2051 even in a worse position, so that the built-up areas, residential areas in Caledon, would have even lower densities and even greater car dependency than Mississauga has now, and Brampton would as well. So we're looking not just at duplicating the mistakes of Mississauga, but actually making them worse. And so the overall density of these community areas would only be 70 people and jobs per hectare across Peel. And so the third aspect is that, so the new development would be sprawl, but the other piece of this picture is that the sprawl that Peel region already has would remain sprawl in the future. So I just want to underline, this is a shaded population density map of Peel region. The southern part of Peel region is the first one, and I just pulled out Caledon East on the right. And I want to underline only the tiny fragments that are in the very darkest purple on this map. So not this kind of jam-like purple, but almost black. Those almost black little flecks. There are only a few of them on this map. Those are the only areas in Peel region that have the population densities that you need in order to really achieve high active transportation modal share. And basically this plan, it only focuses development along a few corridors, and it leaves the vast majority, all this area in light blue, that is nowhere near. We're talking like light years away from the densities that you need in order to fix your modal share and get people out of cars. They want to leave it in that state. So I just want to show you here. This is the town of Caledon East within Caledon. And these white areas, this means that there are, fewer than 20 people and jobs per hectare in existing developed residential streets. And the light blue is also less than 20 people and jobs per hectare. That's the current state of affairs. And the official plan doesn't really offer any solution to fixing that. So those are the broad stroke kind of problems with the current official plan proposal. But on a very practical level, the analysis, the city's own or the region's own analysis of the official plan says it raises a flag that the sprawl that they're proposing and the other kind of development plans that are proposed in the official plan are going to result in Heritage Heights and not being able to achieve the kind of densities that it's supposed to have by 2051, and that the planned major transit station areas, so these are areas where currently Brampton and other Peel Region municipalities, they want to achieve densities that support transit right now, and they want to concentrate development there. Because of the emphasis of sprawl in this plan, they're unlikely to hit their density targets by 2051 either, because we're not just squandering land, but this plan would squander the new homes and workplaces that we need to fix Peel Region's existing neighborhoods. It squanders them on more sprawl. And this means that, if you support Heritage Heights and if you want existing neighborhood, you support the plans that local municipalities are paying lip service to, you have to oppose this current draft overall official plan, and in particular oppose the settlement area boundary expansion. So just underlining here, the new greenfield densities are quite low. Thirdly, I think you'll hear many folks pay lip service to the idea of opposing the 413. So I just want to underline the 413 is an alternative to and not compatible with the Heritage Heights proposal that we've seen, which is a more traditional urban neighborhood that's planned for the northwest corner of Peel Region, and frankly is a lot closer to what all of Peel should have been built as. So this plan, nominally, it pays lip service to the idea that it does not depend on the 413. It doesn't support or endorse the 413. But if you look at the shape of the development plan, is very and where sprawl is intended to go, it is very clearly connected to plans for the 413. That line, that black line at the top of the new greenfield development area, that's the line of the 413. And the types and modes, the types of uses that are planned, the placement of planned industrial uses, warehouse and distribution facilities, it's all, quietly built around the 413 while pretending that it's not, very frankly. So why is this happening? I mean, at one level, this is being pushed by the province. So the province has pushed Peel Region into this position by pushing 80% of new residents into suburbs and out of Toronto. Right now, 40% of residents live in Toronto. They want to get that down to less than 20% and put the burden on municipalities like Peel, Halton, Durham, and York, and Hamilton. They've lowered the density targets. So the province used to require more efficient land use, not quite where it needs to be, but the absolute legal minimum used to be 80 people per hectare. A sustainable greenfield density is around 100 people per hectare. The minimum now has been lowered to 50 per hectare. So the planned densities that Peel is using now are lower than what was the absolute legal minimum in 2020 because the province changed the rules midway. And then thirdly, the province has approved something called the Land Needs Assessment Methodology for the Greater Golden Horseshoe. So this methodology is designed to sort of railroad municipalities into choosing low-rise forms, because the key thing is it uses a sort of a black box process that generally municipalities contract out in order to look back to the past and estimate the share of people who historically, in the 80s and 90s, would have lived in single family and semi-detached homes. And it says you've got to build as best you can that same share of housing in that form as would have been used in the past. And then so it either falls as a single or semi, a townhouse or apartment. You've got to, those shares have to reflect what they call a market-based approach, which is really, not an accurate description of what we're talking about. So the question is, well, if the province has pushed this on Peel, how can we avoid the settlement area boundary expansion that's currently being proposed? How can we avoid scrapping Heritage Heights? One, we can increase low-rise intensification to fix existing neighborhoods. So the current plan assumes that in order to get a higher share of housing accommodated within existing neighborhoods, you have to plan more high-rise buildings and build fewer single and semi-detached homes. And they say that that's impossible or it's not allowed because the rules are dictating the share of houses that have to be built as singles and semis. But that assumes that intensification has to be high-rise buildings. The current plan leaves all the existing residential neighborhoods largely untouched, and that doesn't need to be the case. So right now, if we go with the plan as is, buildings like this, so this is Larry Street in Caledon, they're not going to stay that way, but they're going to be replaced by buildings like this. I'm sorry, I don't know what's happened, but there's a photo here. It's just not showing up on your screen for some reason. Hold on. So basically it's McMansions. They're being converted into McMansions. But we can actually add a lot more housing in a low-rise form to existing neighborhoods. So instead of building those singles in greenfield, you can add them to the existing neighborhoods by allowing the construction of semi-detached homes, townhomes, and other low-rise housing forms on the same lots where currently you're only allowed to build singles. And so lots, houses, those bungalows that are going to get converted anyway into something new, that same floor space can be used to create multiple homes, ground-related homes with little yards instead of McMansions. And so this same approach can be applied to the existing designated greenfield area outside of Heritage Heights. So any greenfield that is developed can be developed along tried and true formats. So right now, you'll hear from planning staff that 75 people per hectare is the best that we can do. But that has to do with putting all of your parking on existing lots and building in driveways and garages, and that uses up a lot of space, and it reduces the number of people per area of land. So this is a traditional townhouse development. It's not super old, but it uses land efficiently because it uses traditional methods such as street parking and doesn't have to set them back as far. So we change our existing neighborhoods through gentle density. We increase the density at which greenfield land is developed. But the third one, and this is a black box that folks don't get into very often, you've seen in our previous slide what the warehouse and distribution centers that Peel uses have looked like to date. But what's not mentioned is that that is an outdated model of building a distribution center. There is a strong trend towards shifting these developments because of automation, makes it much easier, shifting them into multi-story developments. So we have, plenty of examples now of warehousing and development facilities that, rather than having a single or two stories, are 15 up to 20 stories of warehouse and distribution facilities. So there's not really anymore the same requirement that we use the same horizontal model. And by taking this more efficient approach, we can vastly reduce the amount of land that's required for the planned industrial development in Peel. The same number of jobs, same number of tax dollars, but a smaller physical footprint. So it's not too late to use these alternative measures. You got to write your regional and local councillors. If you're here, you've probably already done that. You've got to register to depute at the April 7th Planning and Growth Management Committee meeting. I've misspelt that or miswritten that. Because that's where you're going to decide whether to lock in the horrible plan that's being proposed now or to push for something better. And your third real option, and this is a big one, because we've mentioned, the current plans. These are, in many ways, it's a result of a provincial attempt to railroad municipalities into doing this. You can vote in the next provincial election, though, and there are strong indications that there are going to be options on the table that involve tearing up this current MCR process, canceling the current growth plan, these current perverse rules that are causing these problems, and starting from scratch. And so we're polling all the political parties. We're asking them for answers on what they're going to do about these issues. And so I'd urge you to look at our survey, the results of our questioning of those parties, and vote accordingly. And of course, visit Stop Sprawl Peel.
Phil, thank you so much. It's really great to have so many real tangible solutions and actions people can take, not just, even the policy proposals, for some of us can feel like a distant issue, but, there's real ways we can enable those options and choices, in the weeks, months, and years ahead. So thank you so much for breaking that down. And of course, we have Jenni here with us as well, who did a fantastic look at the situation in Brampton and Caledon. And now we have some time for questions. So we'll try and go quickly, as quickly as we can, to get as many of your questions as possible. And I wonder if we can first just build upon what you had mentioned, Phil. What are some key things people can do in addition to delegating, voting, to fight sprawl where they live here within Peel region?
Well, I think one of the big things is that the common sort of imaginary friend of every developer, and unfortunately it's not always imaginary, is the NIMBY, which is the local residents association that says, oh, we don't want a semi-detached home on that lot. No, I want a single-family home. This is a neighborhood of single-family homes. It's the neighborhood association that complains, oh, there isn't enough parking on this lot. And so basically, when this happens, even if you are worried about these things, you become the talking point of every single developer, because they say we can't add this housing to existing neighborhoods. We need to sprawl outward. So what you can do is A, not be that person, but B, show up in your neighborhood and say, I want a semi-detached home. I want townhomes, and I do not want a single McMansion. You should advocate for a cap on the per unit size. That's where your focus needs to be. You should advocate for less parking on new developments, because every parking space you build is another car that's going to be on the road and creating congestion. If you're worried about congestion for development, advocate against parking.
So there's the voice of no and the no to what we don't want, the sprawl, but there's a clear yes side to that equation, right? Of things we want to support. Jenni, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think it goes to, building complete communities that are enjoyable for people to live in. I look at an example like Riverdale, for instance, where you only have one parking spot per home, but they have these great communities with parks and local, things to do, and people can walk around safely. And that's the kind of community building we should be looking at for the future, as well as looking at mixed housing, housing that is not all the same, that can, fit for all sorts of lifestyles and all sorts of times of life. People who want to downsize, people who want to have co-op housing, there's an affordability and an equity issue as well. We can't keep building single family dwellings and expecting that that's going to solve the affordable housing crisis. It's just not possible.
I fully agree with that. And I wonder to myself, there's a lot of people who want to speak up, and maybe this is their first go at it. So we're asking them to delegate to council on April 7th. What's it actually like, Jenny, for someone like yourself who has delegated and been in that position?
I think it's a great experience. It's a little bit of a learning curve, but it's not difficult. Usually you're given about 5 minutes and you speak from the heart. And, you can be as technical as you like, or you can just, speak to your own experience. You do not have to live in Peel Region to delegate. I think that's an important point.
Right. Yeah.
Many people during this pandemic have been standing up for communities in Halton and Hamilton, even though they may not live there. And that's our right as citizens of Ontario and citizens of the Greenbelt, citizens of, the Greater Golden Horseshoe. We're all in this together, and we've saved some acres in Hamilton and Halton, and now it's Peel's turn. The Greenbelt cannot be a thriving area in isolation. It's a complex system with many tributaries, and it goes beyond municipal boundaries. So if you're a citizen of Ontario who's concerned about your kids' food security, or concerned about affordability, or what the future might look like with a climate emergency, like it's time to speak up, and it's a great experience. And I think people who have done it have walked away feeling quite empowered and quite satisfied to contribute in such a positive way.
I agree. I was nervous the first time I did it, and it was so worth it, because it really, it's democracy in action, right? It's civic engagement, and it reminds us that we are the ones who are, electing our representatives, who are making these decisions, and we have a say, not just on election day, but all the time in between. And I also just want to quickly mention, you are seeing it on your screen occasionally pop up. Visit stopsprawlpeel.org. There will be more resources put there on things like the upcoming delegation, as well as future events which are coming up in addition to this webinar. Okay, let's go on to another question. We have a couple more minutes. So we've recently heard about something called the Housing Affordability Task Force report. This is one of our commenters asking about this report, which recommended all sorts of changes to land use planning in Ontario. How are these reflected in the Peel Region official plan, and how can they be, I guess they were trying to say, how can they be implemented, or what will be their impact?
Right. So, the answer to that question, first of all, is they are not reflected at all in the Peel Regional official plan. The provincial government has been playing a kind of a funny game, because they're getting credit for the stuff that is in the Housing Affordability Task Force report without ever saying that they're going to do any of it. They've not made any commitment to that effect, and they are aggressively pushing every municipality to lock in official plans that expressly presume that those things aren't going to happen and get in the way of those things happening. So there are bad things in the Housing Affordability Task Force report. There's some things that we shouldn't do, but there are some things that are very good. And one of the main things is getting rid of what's called exclusionary zoning. So this is rules that prevent you from adding more semi-detached homes or townhomes or walk-up apartments in a neighborhood that currently has single-family homes. So province is getting credit because this task force that it supported is saying you shouldn't be able to prohibit those things. The province is getting credit for saying, having these people say, and it's presumed the province is going to do this, it's going to get rid of those rules that prevent that from happening. But this plan assumes that none of that will happen. If we implement the Housing Affordability Task Force, that means that there is, even more clearly than now, zero need for settlement area boundary expansion, because every single and semi-detached home, every single person that they're saying would need to be allocated to the greenfield areas, to new greenfield, could be accommodated within either existing neighborhoods or through more efficient use of existing greenfield areas. So this is really a good reason, and something you should raise in your deputations, to really slam the brakes on the MCR process and see how much the province actually does to get rid of exclusionary zoning. Because if we factor in that, we really don't need this sprawl.
That's eye-opening. I actually didn't know it wasn't included at all. And there's a bit of a follow-up question to that, where one person watching here has commented, they've read about they've of course read about these plans, and they've heard that the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing won't approve OPs or official plans if they don't extend the settlement area boundary. So are we at risk of getting this imposed on us by the province if we don't adopt a specific expansion?
Well, so I mentioned I'm a land use planning and environmental lawyer, and the focus of my presentation was on identifying the legal reasons that are being used to justify the sprawl, but also to identify an approach that we can advocate for that complies with the rules. So what I'm posing, right, is you have to expressly ask that the same number of single and semi-detached homes be accommodated within the existing settlement area boundary as are proposed under this plan through boundary expansion. And that means more efficient land use, so that the municipality, it will keep doing this and pretend that it's not doing this. It will keep, the staffs will say, oh, we can increase the density because that won't comply. But the assumption is that they have to change the housing mix. That the only way to make more efficient use of land is to build towers instead of townhomes or semis. And what we've shown through in some of my slides is that you can simply build smaller, more compact, single and semi-detached homes and townhomes without allocating that kind of on-lot land for parking, without garages, with more modest square footage, which is what we need in order to actually make the homes affordable. A 3,000 square foot home is not going to be affordable no matter how many you build of them, because it's because of construction costs. The average house that was constructed in 1970s was 1,050 square feet in area, right? So that's well within the range. That's the size typically of the maximum garden suite that's proposed now. So we need to get back to that model of building new homes, stop squandering land on driveways and parking lots, go back to street parking, and we can get this done within the existing settlement area and without breaking the provincial rules, right? So follow talk about that, same number of homes, same number of people, same mix of homes, but in more compact form. And then you won't, there's not the window for the province to overturn your boundary expansion.
Well, everyone, you did hear it from someone with also a legal perspective. So that's really fantastic. It's about the targets, not the area, is what I'm hearing.
That's right. Yeah. So the province was hoping that to railroad folks in, but this is the premise of the zero boundary expansion in Halton, the premise of the zero boundary expansion that has been approved in Hamilton, is that there's a way to do it and comply. And so what you want is the municipality to say, we are complying. We're not asking the municipality to say, we're defying the rules. We're asking them to not give the government what it wants while still complying with the rules. Because the word of the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, we have the rule of law in Canada. So the minister can say whatever he wants. He can want whatever he wants. But what we're required to do as municipalities is what's spelled out in the law. And what we're proposing is compliant.
Jenni, did you want to add to this, or we can go on to the next question?
No, thank you, Phil. That was very, very interesting. And that is really good information for April 7th. And I've learned a few things just now that I did not realize. So thank you for that. Let's go to the next question. please.
Absolutely. So we'll maybe do 2 more questions. I also just wanted to do a shout out to, there is a fantastic opportunity to keep this knowledge and conversation growing before April 7th, and that is the rally on March 29th. So you will find that info on stopsprawlpeel.org. That's going to be another chance to connect with people who are experts in their field, people who are really passionate about this issue, and those who are really talking about solutions, what they've learned in neighboring regions, as well as right here in Peel. So there will be an opportunity for you to contribute directly. We'll do a bit of fundraising, and it'll just be a great time to work towards these goals that we have. So please, again, do check out stopsprawlpeel.org to register for that community meeting and rally on March 29th. So in exactly 1 week's time. So this next question was really, it's trying to figure out, well, traffic congestion is already a major problem across the region. And this commenter is saying it is preventing us from creating the jobs we need in Peel. So don't we need the 413 to fix congestion?
So I think this is kind of the government's main talking point, in support of the 413. We need to get around faster. And who doesn't agree with that, right? Like the kind of main focus of, a lot of your presentations was how difficult it is right now to get around in Peel. The fact is right now, most people are car dependent. They're trapped in their cars. And so if you stay within that box, if you think, oh, a highway, right? Well, the reality is we have a long history of highways being built, and traffic never gets any better. The reality is, according to the government's own plan, its own analysis that was done, Highway 413 would only save 30 seconds on average for long distance commutes for residents of the existing residents. It's 30 seconds for $6 or $7 billion. And that's for the commutes. But at the same time, we know that it would drive up traffic everywhere else. Every additional person who's going to be drawn out living in these car-dependent communities, and using this highway, and all of that existing car traffic that's built around that highway-based model, it's all going to mean more traffic on your local roads. It's going to make congestion worse. Basically, more cars equals more congestion, and building major highways like this means more cars. The government's own analysis, which I believe now has been pulled off, public websites, shows that the same time savings can be achieved through changes in the way that existing roads are managed, right? Roads like the 407, etc., by prioritizing truck traffic on those roads, by really, applying the measures that we know are available and off-the-shelf measures to use those roads more efficiently. And we can do that without all the negative side effects of sprawl, without driving up car traffic. The 413 is a plan to make traffic worse, not make traffic better.
Yeah, I would just add it's already happening, and the highway isn't even built yet because we have all this speculation happening along the route, and that needs to be shut down. And that's why we need to also oppose the boundary expansion. And really, logistically, traffic is flowing north-south. That's where the traffic is coming from in Bolton. And that's what local councillors are saying. They need an extension of the 427. The 413 will not solve congestion. It's in the wrong direction. And we need transit. And I do support the idea of public transit 100%, but I don't support local councillors or mayors pretending like it's coming and building subdivisions that will only increase congestion when we know that there is no GO train that can be funded. So, we need to push back on that and say zero boundary expansion, fix the communities we have, and let's plan, in a sustainable, smart way, and not, build another highway that we know is not going to solve anybody's commute.
And you can tell. Here's how you tell if your councillor is earnestly interested in a development being served by transit or is just gaslighting. Ask them if they're willing to get rid of the garages and on-lot parking for that development. Because if people in a development are actually going to use transit, you don't need that parking, right? It means that you reduce the number of cars per unit. You build a neighborhood on the assumption that it only works if you have the transit. If, you know, in a neighborhood that's built, you can't have a neighborhood where every house could work for both. You have to pick. If you're going to build a transit supportive neighborhood, that means you have to build a neighborhood that doesn't work on the basis of everyone driving. You have to pick, because once you add that parking in, once you add those garages in, you get the density, you make the density too low, you make every walk to transit too far because all that extra space has been added. So you've got to pick. So that means they've got to build it from the scratch without the parking. And if they don't do that, that means they're not being honest. They have no intention of ever delivering the transit.
And it can be so hard to like wrap our head around, well, you know, of course developments need parking lots and roads connecting to them. But, you know, I always go back to think about the places we want to travel, the places we want to go and visit, that we love to dwell in. We don't love to dwell in those places sitting in traffic in a car. We love to get on the transit, to walk on the cobbled streets, to weave through the alleys, which are just for people and bikes. And yet it seems like an impossible scenario here, except for in the flashiest of new developments, you know, at least on paper. So I'd say, you know, it's either that or a zombie highway and a ghost train, right? So you have an option being presented, and there's money involved in both. It costs money regardless, but how do we want to move, and how do we want to feel in places where we're spending most of our life? Do we want it to feel hostile, or do we want it to feel like the places, you know, we like to visit?
And I think part of it is, you know, if you want this to happen, I think you have to make it clear that there are going to be political and electoral consequences for councillors who play these games. And I think a simple thing you can tell your regional councillor, your local council, if you vote for boundary expansion, I'm not going to vote for you in this fall's election. And I'm going to support an alternative candidate. Make it black and white. Do not vote for boundary expansion if you want my vote. You will not get it. Like black and white. Got to make it that clear.
So I think we've already covered this. I'll just quickly put up this last question before we wrap up. Could we talk a little bit more briefly on transportation alternatives to address the transportation demand we have right now and in the future?
So I think, Jenny, you're probably a pretty good expert on a lot of that, and you yourself, Rahul.
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing would be to address the transportation issue is stop approving warehouses and e-commerce buildings and massive distribution centers. You know, we keep promoting truck traffic, and we need to actually promote local food. I think that's the first thing. I do think we need more public transit, and it needs to be connected. People don't want to wait for 50 minutes for a bus. It will drive them to the car. So we need more investment in transit of all kinds, BRT, LRT. The federal government has recently supported LRT in Mississauga. We need more of that. But we also need to recognize that, you know, we need connected communities where people can actually walk to get their day-to-day needs met and not, you know, be isolated and freezing doing so, or having to wait, you know, 55 minutes for transit that's too expensive. So we need to have more funding on transit, and we need to stop promoting this idea of highway and sprawl in the car.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll add to that, you know, we can look at models where we encourage by providing these frequent alternatives, but we also charge for those that are driving in a place where maybe it's not as needed. So congestion pricing, right? You know, you have the stick and the carrot to encourage the modes and how you want people to move in their region. So let's hear from you, Phil, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I just want to point out that if you want to succeed in these transportation measures, it's very important to stop treating transportation decisions as something separate, like a separate Lego piece from your land use planning, your zoning, and your boundary expansion decisions. You need a density of at least 90, probably 100 people per hectare in order to support the transit that we're talking about. So that means that that's got to be the absolute floor density that you're building. And only then can you start to support the transit that you need, which is frequent transit all day long, not just at fixed times during the day, so that if you need to go to the hospital in the middle of the night, you need to go to a pharmacy, there's some kind of emergency, you can always rely on transit to do that. Then if you're getting home from the bar in the middle of the night, you can also rely on transit to do that as well. So you've got to plan densities that have enough people to allow that to happen without a huge public subsidy. And that means 100 people in jobs per hectare. That gives you enough people riding to support your system, largely based on fare box. And that is the secret of the TTC. It's because so many parts of Toronto already have those densities. It means that they can run most of their service based on just the fares that people pay, which is not true elsewhere in the GTA. Like you have operating costs that far exceed your fares because the densities are too low.
And with that, and thank you to our audience for these fantastic questions. We're going to close the questions there for now. And if you have more questions, again, you can always email info@yourstoprotect.ca. Really fantastic questions and really fantastic answers that I hope will encourage more of you to consider making a deputation on April 7th. So as a final reminder, this is a really important and crucial vote, either at that meeting or the meeting that follows. April 7th is when you should depute. You can register through the Region of Peel's website once the meeting info is up. And of course, we will provide resources to help you depute and do something that feels comfortable to you on that date. You can see the campaign websites here on your screen, as well as a blog post which talks a bit more unpacking the problem of sprawl in the region and more broadly across the Greater Golden Horseshoe. So please do reach out to us if you have any questions at the email we mentioned, info@yourstoprotect.ca. And of course, visit stopsprawlpeel.org. The broader campaign is like the email, yourstoprotect.ca. So that's where you can find info about the larger issues we've been talking about, not just in Peel, but right across, again, the region. And we hope you will keep in touch and get involved for that crucial vote. We'll leave it at there for now. I want to give a special thanks to our guests here today that really helped us better understand the situation in Peel. Phil and Jenni, thank you so much for your time. And we look forward to continuing this conversation leading up to April 7th.
Thank you both very much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Take care, and we'll see you at our next event.